We got something cooking you might be interested in.
Not gonna like the sound of this.
Been cooking since Horseshoe, but you went and kicked up all that commotion in Valentine. How come every time I get in trouble, I'm called a fool and an idiot? But when you get in trouble, oh, it's just one of them things.
It's a good point, Arthur.
A very good point.
All right, well, what do y'all want me to do?
Hit the goddamn bank with us.
Bill Williamson is often overlooked as a fool, a man who was so useless and fell to drinking and deviant behavior he was kicked out of the United States Army. Bill often isn't considered to be much of use within the ranks of the Vanderlyn gang. He's often taunted by other members, namely Arthur and John, and even a little relentlessly by Dutch.
Hey, Bill, you were a sharpshooter in the cavalry, weren't you?
What?
When we get there, maybe you could help with the suppression fire.
I never said I was no sharpshooter.
Oh, that's right. What was it? The nation's most loyal latrine digger, wasn't that it?
Yeah.
And while he does take part in a handful of missions, I already covered how I feel about him and Javier Escuela practically being underutilized in the grand scheme of things in the story of Red Dead Redemption 2. If you want to check that video out, by all means, feel free to do so. But for today, I want to talk about what is possibly the most successful bank robbery in Red Dead Redemption 2's story. A bank robbery that netted the gang a grand total of $20,000, or almost $750,000 in United States currency today. In terms of the overall take and subsequent law enforcement presence, followed by the well-being of the gang, which was still in a great position because the repercussions of this bank robbery did not follow them all the way back to camp. Although a decent amount of law enforcement blood was shed, all things considered, it was still a success. It is the most successful considering Saint Denis bank robbery ended up with that entire take at the bottom of the ocean with many casualties befalling the Vanderlyn gang, and everything from the Blackwater job was also completely lost. Unfortunately, Blackwater and everything that transpired there isn't witnessed by us, and by the way things are going, possibly never will be. And as the game stands, there's currently only 2 bank robberies, that being Saint Denis, and the other, of course, being the Bank of Valentine. Robbed during the mission Sodom back to Gomorrah. Sodom back to Gomorrah personally is one of my favorite missions in the entire game. Arthur's not yet sick. Bank robberies, of course, are always fun. The Vanderlyn gang appears to be at its peak here, and the very end of this mission shows the wrap-up of Thomas Downs' death, with Arthur returning to Edith and Archie, Thomas's wife and son, who, despite having to bury their beloved father and husband, not only are rewarded with inheriting his debt to the Vanderlyn gang, but now have to move out of their home since they can no longer afford it. And the interaction between Edith, Archie, and Arthur has always been one characterized by a immense lack of empathy and an alarming level of brutality by Arthur, who threatens to have Archie reunite with his father. It's cold-blooded, and it shows just how intimidating Arthur can really be at times. But it's not till when you start to look at this interaction, after realizing Arthur and a few other Vanderlyn members just rode off with saddlebags literally loaded with gold bars, you know, the entire gang is okay. They don't need a few extra dollars yet. It's all a matter of principle here. Principle, none of them are willing to let slide, regardless of how well they're all doing. While the ending is significant in a number of ways, tied to Arthur's own character development among a few other things, let's go back to the events of the main robbery. Going off of a tip initially sniffed out by Karen, Bill, on the way to Valentine, mentions how the bank is going to be hit. He assigns everyone their jobs. Karen is going to be a distraction. Bill and Lenny handle the light security the bank is supposed to have, as well as any customers that decide to play hero. Arthur deals with the vault. All pretty straightforward. Bill also mentions during this time that he's been drinking with the Grays back in the town of Rhodes, trying to set up a job for additional security on behalf of the Grays. This technically is the job that led to the death of Sean, but this whole beginning of the mission, there's a different version of Bill that's much more involved with what the gang is into at this very moment. Yes, there's some banter back and forth between him and Arthur, where clearly Bill's very annoyed and agitated by how much Arthur specifically gets away with, or how much Arthur messes with Bill for all of his screw-ups.
Like I said, you mess up, it's just one of them things. I mess up, I'm the prize idiot.
Well, Bill, I don't know what to tell you.
Surprised you ain't already ripped me about that dynamite again. One mistake, and I'll never live it down.
What do you need? Pat on the back? A medal?
In some ways, it's kind of unfortunate because here, it seems we have a version of Bill that's much more aggressive, somewhat competent, actively taking a role in the gang's activities, trying to further the gang's overall position and actually be a valuable member. Yet it's still somehow reduced in terms of his overall importance, in terms of usefulness, resourcefulness, and even reliability, all because he's pretty much complaining the entire way. If Rockstar decided to switch up this dialogue and made it sound more as if Bill was actually scouting for other opportunities that would benefit the gang and not doing it out of spite and apparent need to outshow Arthur, maybe he could have turned the gang's perception of him around. I'm not saying he had to be one of the more aggressive members that led the charge from here on out, found at the front and center of every major Van der Linde robbery moving forward. I think he could very well have stayed as a background character. Either way, I'm just saying based off his banter here with Arthur, his drive comes more as someone desperate to outshow Arthur and not as someone who can really put together a decent job with a substantial amount of take with minimal risk. And that's something he objectively speaking does here. Yet the gang never acknowledges it. I don't recall anyone ever bringing up the Valentine Bank robbery ever again, which is kind of sad. In the grand scheme of things, it does sort of make sense as it's overshadowed by everything else going on in the roads between the Braithwaite and Gray family. Sodom back to Gomorrah itself is a mission that's sandwiched between clearing out Shady Belle of the Lemoyne Raiders and lifting some nice bolt-action rifles from them, followed then by Arthur getting captured and tortured by Colm O'Driscoll.
How's wound? I hardly feel it. You will. Septic. Ain't nice.
But even then, the mission is a nice break from the careful game of diplomacy the Van der Linde members are playing back in Rhodes, returning to the good old-fashioned business of robbing an establishment that can't afford to spare the funds, as far as the robbers are concerned anyways. And plus, as Bill put it himself, it's quote-unquote unfinished business. Gameplay-wise, I do wish the firefight that erupted in the heart of Valentine as the members tried to escape lasted a little bit longer. It's a little too linear. If you go back and replay the mission, you'll notice none of the responding officers attack from behind. They're all funneled in front of you, and the only time they're really behind you is when they're pursuing you on horseback, which all feels a little light in terms of hitting a bank in Valentine, especially compared to the type of response you have to deal with when you just start opening fire on people in Valentine by yourself, or even when you go to rob the O'Driscoll's business in the back of the doctor's office. It seems like whenever you're just killing people just for the sake of it, the response is a lot more punitive. And you see a lot of sheriffs or bounty hunters or just even townsfolk running in between buildings, down alleyways from behind corners you would never expect, and you don't have any of that during this mission, which when you put it under a microscope, obviously it's not going to hold up to its standards, and it just makes this overall mission just feel like a set piece. But I guess technically, even looking at Saint Denis bank robbery, that's the same exact thing, although that has bigger implications on the story overall. This is more, I think story-wise, this mission is more tied to closing off the Thomas Downs timeline and gives a very rare glimpse of how competent Bill can be, even if the driving factor is a little bit more questionable. But the mission itself, I still say, is one of my favorite missions of the entire game. I think just the concept of finally getting to rob a bank that's pretty successful, the trench coat that Arthur and everybody's completely decked out in, they just look amazing. I think it's one of the rare glimpses for me that feels like you're an actual terrifying outlaw, and going to the Downs' ranch and threatening wife and son really drives that point home.